Hi, everyone. Welcome to Chicago Autism Network's virtual parent workshop. Tonight, we're really excited to hear from speech language pathologist Stephanie Sorrentino on how to help our kids with their picky eating habits. So I will turn the time over to Stephanie.
Hi, everyone. My name is Stephanie, and I am a speech language pathologist from North Shore Pediatric Therapy. Thank you so much for having me, Kimmy. Okay, well, the title on here is actually from my last webinar that I did for the Chicago Autism Network, Fed Up, Feeding Fundamentals. So I must not have changed the title, but you can also find that, like Kimmy was saying, on their YouTube channel. It's a good prerequisite for this one, which is mealtime tips for parents. So we really wanted to go ahead and give parents tips that they can use at home. A little bit about me. I'm a speech language pathologist. I've been with North Shore Pediatric Therapy for 7 years now. Right now I do community outreach, and I also treat out of our Naperville clinic. Recently I took a position at St. Xavier University as one of their adjunct faculty. So just mentoring and supervising their graduate students. And I absolutely love doing that. I love doing these webinars and I love teaching. My areas of expertise are autism, feeding, ADHD, and processing disorders. But I love all of speech. So, and all of the whole world of autism. So if there's something that you have a question about, feel free to reach out to me and I will connect you with somebody who is an expert. Just a couple disclosure statements. So I am an NSPT paid employee. We are a sponsor of the Chicago Autism Network. I volunteer on the special events committee, and I also do community outreach for NSPT. And some disclaimers. This is not medical advice, so I always encourage you to consult with your pediatrician regarding your child's care. They should always be that first point of contact. And just a couple of things to note. There's limited research on feeding and autism. So sometimes when we're pulling from research, it may be from a developmental delay group or a different population. As we all know, every child with autism is different. So moving to the next bullet point, there's never a one size fits all approach. Except for I firmly believe that any feeding therapy approach should be multidisciplinary for a child with autism. We need to look at the whole child, and that means all of those disciplines. And then high quality feeding intervention starts with high quality assessment. So making sure that we are, again, looking at the whole child, everything from allergies to potentially genetics to, what are their preferences and what are the family's preferences. And then my number one rule in all of life is no parent shaming. So if you find a piece of material on here or bullet point and you're like, oh, I've definitely been doing that at home, I do not want you to shame yourself. We're here to learn, and that's what this is all about. So my goals for us today, I want you guys to learn some symptoms of feeding difficulties, common reasons why children with autism won't eat, and then what are those feeding pitfalls? So maybe things that we might be doing as parents or family members, and how those things may play a role. And then the sensory and motor aspects, what's a food jag and how to prevent them, and then strategies to use at home. So fun facts again, children with autism are 5 times more likely to struggle with feeding, and 74% of children with autism have a comorbid feeding disorder. Only 3% of feeding disorders are behavioral. And so 97% of the time, there might be an underlying medical cause contributing. Okay, so here are some of the common reasons that children won't eat. And this was such an exhaustive list that I really had to pull out just the main ideas and explain everything else underneath it. So, of course, a lot of our children with autism have allergies, they have gastro or stomach issues. Maybe they aren't able to communicate those things to us, so they're uncomfortable or they experience discomfort when they're eating. And that's a huge issue. Another big one is GERD, or gastro, basically reflux that comes up after eating certain foods. And as many of our parents with autism know, once one bad or negative experience might happen with a child with autism, then they may fear that and have a really aversive reaction moving forward. Another reason might be their motor or oral motor issues. So maybe they don't have necessarily the postural control to hold themselves up. Maybe they're drooling a lot and they don't have a lot of strength in their oral motor cavity, meaning where you actually bite and chew your food. Maybe they have sensory processing disorder and they're very hypersensitive to certain things, or very, very, maybe they're not sensitive at all. And so they need a lot of input. There are some of those learning and behavioral challenges. So maybe, some cognitive difficulties, memory, and sometimes with behavior, throwing food on the floor. Maybe they're running around naked before mealtime. That is one of my current kids right now. Maybe they have some nutritional issues. So maybe they don't have, they have a malabsorption disorder and they don't get the nutrients that they need from their food. And then there are some of those parent or family influenced factors. Like, do we have the environment set up? Are we establishing a mealtime routine? And some of those things that we do have control over. So I'm guessing this is why a lot of you are here. Here are some of those feeding pitfalls that, as a practitioner, I see parents fall into, allowing your child to eat whenever they want. So this is a big one and probably my number one thing. If you take anything away from this presentation, it's that your child needs a schedule. If we allow our child to graze and eat whenever they want, their appetite will not be sufficient for when it is mealtime. You might only feed the child the same foods that they like repeatedly, and that's understandable. We want our kids to eat. And sometimes we'll do anything such as hiding or sneaking foods or ingredients in. We might be feeding our child when we know they can feed themselves, or we might be using external validation, meaning bribes, showing them that we're super disappointed in them, stickers, even other food rewards. So these are the things that we want to avoid. And if you are doing some of these things right now, it's okay. They're pitfalls for a reason, and that means it's very common. So we can talk later on about what you can do about those pitfalls. So common symptoms of feeding difficulties. There's so many, but these are the main ones that I want to pull from. Adverse reactions to new foods or food refusal. So your child might push a new food away. They might scream, hit, avoid coming to the table at all times when it's mealtime. A mealtime experience exceeding 30 plus minutes. Think about how long it takes your child to eat. And if it's more, and 30 minutes is being generous and including all of the routines. If it's more than that, that could be indicative of a feeding disorder, and you might want to get your child evaluated. Maybe they have poor weight gain or excessive weight gain, and that can lead to some growth issues as well. If they're eating fewer than 20 foods, and this is unfortunately a lot of our kids with autism. If they're limiting intake to only one food group, and I put starches in parentheses because I know how much our kids with autism loves starches, love crunchy foods, love them. Or maybe they're only sticking to that one consistency. So kids that might have some oral motor issues, or they might fatigue easily, they may not have enough tongue control, and they might always result to really soft foods. And then another big one is no longer accepting foods they once loved. There's lots more here. Coughing while eating, regurgitating food, gagging, mouth stuffing, meaning they eat so fast they look like a little bunny cartoon character, shoving the carrot in their mouth. We wish it was a carrot, right? It's probably not. Swallowing food whole without chewing food, pocketing or holding food in their mouth. Like I already said, no longer accepting foods they once loved. And then this is a really big one I want parents to look out for. Taking a drink during chewing or immediately after they swallow every single time. And then, of course, as you know, anxiety, avoidance, irritability when it's mealtime. So let's talk about motor and how motor plays a role in feeding development. And I'm going to give a few examples, but basically when your child is learning to walk and coordinate their bodies, they need to use core strength. And that means that they can use their extremities, their arms, their legs, eventually, wiggle their fingers, wiggle their toes. They can, sorry, the lights just shut off where I'm at. They can use their extremities. And this is really important because for mealtime, we need our kids to be able to hold themselves up and maintain posture. And we don't really think about that a lot. When we don't have a stable base, it makes it harder for us to coordinate all of those smaller movements. If your child has a weak jaw, they might hold the food in their mouth when they become fatigued. And as a speech pathologist, always working on oral motor, I see this a ton. And that could mean that your child is not ready for those really tough solids. Or maybe they need to be in therapy when they're working on them. Another example would be poor tongue coordination. So instead of moving their tongue side to side, they might be mashing their tongue and it will just hit the top of their palate. And that's how they chew their food. So motor skills are critical for the positioning that we have for feeding. So we want to stay at 90, 90, 90 degrees. The pace or the rate that we eat, how we put food in our mouths, how we chew our food, our tongue control for solids and honestly liquids or foods that break apart, and then the strength and coordination of the lips, tongue, and jaw. So how does sensory play a role? So sensory is huge for our kids with autism. Every child with autism, actually every human being has their own sensory profile of things that we prefer. And this for food applies to taste, but not just taste, also how foods transition while we're chewing them. So if you're thinking about a Dorito, I know that's a fan favorite for a lot of our kids, even me. When you're chewing a Dorito, think about how it starts really, really crunchy, and you might hear that crunch. And then as you're chewing, it changes, and it changes into more of a puree consistency. Your tongue has to manage all the little crumbs that fall apart from it. And then also, while you're chewing, then you have to make sure you have all those pieces, right? There's nothing left in any of the crevices down by our teeth, stuck in between our teeth and our lips, and swallow. So children typically fall into these two categories. One, a child might be hypersensitive, so they may avoid or they may prefer foods that are bland and they may avoid certain foods. Sorry about that. They might be hyposensitive, meaning they need a lot of strong flavors and a lot of input, or they could be mixed. And the way I think of this is we all have our good days and bad days. So having a really good occupational therapist for your child on your team is also crucial because they look at the whole sensory realm. But with feeding and introducing new foods, there are so many components. So there's a visual component. If you think of a food right now that just absolutely disgusts you, and maybe when you look at it, it might make you gag a little bit. For me, I hate seafood. And when I see seafood or crab legs, that grosses me out. Now, I do feeding therapy on myself, but we're not there yet. And so when I see that, I get a visceral reaction in my stomach. I also notice how it smells, and I don't like the fishy smell. Is smell on here? It is not. I will have to add that. The texture of crab legs or seafood, for example, that grosses me out. So think about your foods that really give you the ick. And why do you think they give you the ick? How do those tastes of that food, if you've tried it, how does that play into how you're tolerating the food? Do you typically lean towards sweet foods only or sour, or can you mix your foods? And then of course, there's the temperature. A lot of our kids with autism also are sensitive to temperature. And this is often, we forget this, but if you think about your teeth, and how many kids with autism have a difficult time tolerating, brushing their teeth? And you think about us biting into ice cream or something similar, they may have that adverse reaction. Or I know one of my kids that I'm seeing for therapy right now really prefers his foods piping hot. And that is a challenge when you are bringing foods to and from school, to and from therapy, and just in general. And then just thinking about back to the Dorito thing. So foods change with each stage of feeding and chewing. So the sight of it changes with every bite, our sound changes with every chew, taste. We have enzymes inside of our saliva that actually change the taste. And then texture. So now we're going to jump into the strategies. So these are kind of my 4 main areas of strategies that parents can immediately implement. Social modeling, we're structuring our meal times and snack time routines, accessing the cognitive, and then what types of reinforcement are beneficial. So let's talk about the social experience of mealtime. I always recommend right off the bat when I'm talking to families that they have 1 meal per night. And unfortunately, this is all of what a lot of families can do, right? You might leave for work in the morning, so you don't have breakfast together. Maybe they eat breakfast at daycare or school, and same with lunch. And then dinner is that 1 mealtime experience that everybody gets together aside from the weekends. So I urge families to just start there. Start with eating together. Mealtime is a social experience. And so we want to have our child with autism or any child be able to see us enjoying food and experiencing it in a positive way. And sometimes we have to be very, very obvious about how much we're enjoying our food. So we want to model those good feeding behaviors. So if I was sitting with my child with autism and there were crab legs on the table, I would not be like, ew, I don't like those. I would model in different ways how I'm tolerating having the seafood in front of me, which leads to number 3, discussing food in a positive way. We want to be over exaggerating our motor, meaning if you're going to take a bite, we're going to take a big bite and we're going to chew like a cow and we're going to make it really silly and fun. Imitate your child's feeding, maybe if they're playing with their food a little bit, maybe if they're dipping their finger in yogurt and drawing it on their plate, that you can do the same thing too. And remember, the food is the focus. It seems like we want the child to be the focus, but the food is actually the focus of our meal. So bringing attention to our food, doing something that I call labeling behaviors in our food. So that way we're calling attention, and it's the most interesting thing that's going on aside from our social mealtime experience. The child should be involved in all of these things. We're not going to force them to look over here, but use your relationship. You know your child the absolute best. Connect with them. And then number 10, this one I think falls into each category that I'll talk about, but getting your child to stay at the table. That's why we want our food to be the most interesting thing, our relationship with our food and our family to be the most interesting thing. So that mealtime routine, which is what we'll talk about next, is actually crucial to how you can have your child learn to stay seated at the table. So these are kind of my rules for a structured meal and snack time. Like I said in the beginning, appetite regulation is really, really important. We don't want to allow our child to graze all day long because then they'll never learn to regulate their own appetite. Meals should not last more than 30 minutes. And I say this within reason. If you are already, consulting with the therapist, then go with their recommendation. But oftentimes we need to keep our children on pace. Of course, if they're on a good kick and they're trying a new food and they're enjoying it, we're not going to stop right away. We're going to let them finish that. A big indicator that your child might need oral motor therapy is if they're taking so long to finish a meal. And I see that in my feeding assessments. Our feeding assessments might go the entire hour, and that is not typical. Most kids actually finish mealtime within 20 minutes, 20 to 30 minutes. Think solids first, fluids last. So maybe withholding the fluid for a little bit, not allowing your child to, and of course I'm thinking things like milk or juice, not allowing them to get super full on that. So maybe they're going to try a couple things on their plate and then they can take a sip. Number 4 is also a big one. It's okay to get messy. We have to encourage, especially our kids with autism who have these sensory difficulties, we have to encourage them to play using their hands, putting their hands in food, not being afraid to get their hands dirty. And basically making sure that, having our face and our hands messy is a safe thing. We can take a paper towel and wipe our hands if it's super messy. Another thing we can do is serve a variety of food consistencies. So even if we know our child is not going to eat it, it is so important to continue to expose their sensory system over 30 times to that new food. That doesn't even have to mean that it's on their plate. Maybe it's in the center of the table and we are serving food for each family member, and they're only comfortable having that food on their, what I call their later plate, or K2Me calls it your later plate. So foods that maybe they'll try later, and then eventually they'll hopefully interact with that food. Present food in manageable bites. And then this is huge. One preferred food offered at every single meal. Oftentimes, when it's dinner time, this truly is the only time your child is going to get to eat. So that old school way of discipline, finish your plate, is not always the best approach for our kids with autism. We really want them to be able to feel safe and positive during mealtime. And so make sure that you have one preferred food, one food that they like and they will eat on their plate at any time. And then 3 foods at any one time, making sure they have at least one protein. And that doesn't have to mean meat. That's just any good source of protein, 1 fruit or vegetable, and then 1 starch. That rule of thumb for 1 tablespoon per year of age. I have more information if you need that for the actual amount of foods that kids should be eating. But as we review this information, a lot of our kids aren't even tolerating a tablespoon yet. So if you do need that info, let me know. I'm happy to share. But that's something to keep in mind. Kind of like our other bullet point, I can't find it right now, but several foods on the table for exposure. So it's not a bad thing for dad to enjoy his chicken and mom to enjoy her broccoli, and for them to share and then maybe try and put it on the child's later plate. We want those foods on the table for exposure. And then, of course, that mealtime, we're limiting our meals or our snacks to 15 to 30 minutes. Establishing a mealtime routine. So setting a schedule and eating at the same time each day is really important. Helping your child become prepared for mealtime with activities that signal it's time to eat. Something I actually accidentally left out of here is parents always ask me, how do I get my child to just stay seated? And that's a layer. I have a layered response for that. But a big thing is prepping them with some input before they sit down to eat. So if you have a really active little one, maybe they need some time on the playground beforehand, or they could actually help you, by pushing chairs in or setting the table, getting them ready to have mealtime is really important, and getting them a little, what we call regulated. So they're not up out of their chair. And then everyone models eating the food using a later plate. The entire family stays at the table. This is a tough one, or stays involved in the mealtime experience for the whole time. And then always assign a cleanup routine for the child, even if that means that they're clearing their plate and they're putting it in the sink. Okay. So the nitty-gritty of structured meal times. The location of the meal should be the same as much as possible. And I do encourage families to eat at the kitchen table. If you guys are always eating at a coffee table, try and see if there's an opportunity to check for positioning there. Can your child really sit where their hips are at a 90-degree angle and their knees are at that 90-degree angle, and are their feet flat on the floor so they have a stable base? If we can do that, then that's great. If not, I would make it a goal to try and move the family to a kitchen table with appropriate seating for the child. And then provide postural support if needed. So I have a good example of this with actually one of my older kids that I see for feeding. He tends to want to stand up and rock while he's eating his favorite foods. He's a very chatty 8-year-old, adorable. But what that tells me is he might not have that regulation and the postural stability for sitting for a long period of time. So what I did was And then this was me just improvising last week, as I grabbed the step stool that was in our therapy kitchen, and I had him put his feet on the step stool. It wasn't a perfect 90-degree angle, but it worked. And he actually sat in the chair for the rest of the time. So it's important to make sure, if your child's feet aren't touching, that we have that stable base. Your routine to a meal. So giving them a 5-minute warning, doing that transition activity. And remember that sensory activity before all of this. So maybe they're playing at the park, maybe they're playing with kinetic sand, maybe they're playing with slime. There's that. And then there's, in 5 minutes, it's time to eat. And then in 1 minute, we're gonna go wash our hands. And that's what that transition activity is. We're gonna push our chair to the table, and then we sit at the table. We can serve family style. So like I was saying before, taking food from the middle, everybody gets a little bit. If your child won't tolerate having it on their plate, that's okay. We can put it on their later plate. If they can't tolerate looking at it on their later plate, then let's take a paper towel and cover it, or put another plate on top of it. And then we could play peekaboo with our later plate later. We eat, we can clean up, assigning that activity to them. And my positioning bullet point was out of order. So with cleaning up, we can make that an interactive experience. It's also a really good time for your child to see foods maybe that are all mixed together, right? But they're not thinking about it in terms of, oh, I have to eat this. So they might be more accepting of that sensory experience. So how can we play with our food to make a different connection? And here are just some examples, but we want to create that meaningful connection with our kids for how we interact with food through play. Some things you can do are involving your child all the time in some of that mealtime preparation, especially, and we'll talk about food jags, especially as you're trying to get them to experience new foods. So when you think preschool and they're taking, the big peppers and they're dipping that in paint, what I hope everyone knows what I'm talking about, or they might cut a potato in half and we're using those as stamps. That is a great way and a great sensory activity to interact with food in a non-threatening way, in a way that you're not going to eat it. But also adding language all about our food. So crushing foods with our fingers, talking about how, oh, this is what our teeth do. And they break it up into really tiny pieces, and calling attention to how we're breaking food down. Same with brushing teeth, counting molars, encouraging that vibrating toothbrush to go, to the right and get on that lateral or in the pockets of your mouth on both sides. And then just understanding and labeling and modeling as a parent, when you're hungry and, oh, my tummy feels so much better after I eat, things like that. Okay, reinforcement. So any therapist will tell you this, but your kids are obsessed with you. You might know this as well, as they're following you to the bathroom, but your kids love your verbal praise. It works great most of the time. We want to keep mealtime as positive as possible. So giving them that verbal praise for even the smallest step, touching the carrot, putting the carrot to their nose, putting it to their lips, any of that, wow, I love how you tried your carrot or you licked your carrot, being very specific about what that child's doing and letting them know that this is a positive thing. Speaking positively about food as well. Also reinforcing and praising, if they have siblings, their siblings eating. Saying, oh my goodness, look at I can't think of anyone. Look at Kimmy trying her corn right now. Kimmy, can you tell us what flavors does it taste like? And just really talking and discussing that food. And then they get to see that their sibling is getting that positive reinforcement. Number 4, we kind of already went over, but giving them any positive or reinforcing them for any positive food behavior. And then number 5, avoid using preferred foods or foods in general as a reward. And this can be kind of a touchy subject, which is also why it's so critical to have a multidisciplinary team that gives their input to how are we going to actually praise our child for this food. So if you are having your child try new foods, we don't want to say, if you try this food, I'll give you a brownie if he loves brownies. We want to make sure that it's more of a natural consequence. We want to make sure that reinforcement as much as possible is what is going to get them to continue to eat foods. And then in terms of a lot of our children with autism get ABA services. And there's actually research that says that primary reinforcer, meaning if they're giving your child food or M&Ms or something, a preferred food for every time they do some sort of behavior or some sort of activity, make sure that the team you're working with, including your pediatrician, is looped in on that. Because for a child with autism that might have nutritional difficulties or deficiencies, that could really play a big role in their diet. Or, maybe they're not going to eat their lunch later on. We want to make sure that we're not spoiling their diet, but we're giving them a balanced opportunity. And then also, food as a reward is not always the healthiest relationship with food. In fact, it's not. So just making sure that you're discussing this openly and that there's a strategy for that. Okay, food jags. What is a food jag? Almost every single child I've ever worked with for feeding experiences a food jag or some sort of food jag, at least with one food. So it's when a child eats the same food prepared the same way over and over again, because it's all they will eat. It's very common in kids with autism because we know that they are very restrictive. Kids with autism have their preferences. They are comfortable and feel safe with certain foods and routines. But the risk with this is the child could get tired of the food and begin to refuse it altogether. I know my mom used to pack me a ham sandwich every single day in 3rd grade. And I remember all of 4th and 5th grade, I said, I do not want another ham sandwich to save my life, Mom. I will make my own food, whatever. I don't want another ham sandwich. And even now, sometimes I get a little nauseous if I bring some sort of lunch meat food to work with me. But children can end up losing that food in their repertoire, meaning they will refuse it altogether. Kind of going back to food jags really quickly and just giving an example. One of my kids loves Uncrustables. And when he would come in therapy, he would eat Uncrustables with me, but Mom would say that they would always end up in his lunchbox when he came home. So we knew he wasn't really eating them at school. And Mom asked him what was wrong. And he said that it was strawberry and not grape. Okay, so now just that one experience with him made him refuse it altogether. So he was refusing any Uncrustable, lost trust with it completely. And so what I actually recommended and what we ended up doing in therapy, because he has a very limited food repertoire, is I had him bring enough for peanut butter and jelly. We made our own Uncrustables. And he ate them with me. And then I had mom and him do it at home, like 2 or 3 times a week. And not only did we get him to tolerate strawberry jelly, we got him to tolerate strawberry jelly on a different slice of bread, not an Uncrustable, but probably a little bit healthier of an option. So that's one way to kind of resolve a food jag. It's a very specific example, but think about your own child and their own food jags with foods that they might refuse. So how can we avoid food jags? We want to make sure we're alternating preferred foods. So giving them a food that they love and will eat every other day for their main meal. So chicken nuggets is a big one. Alternating chicken nuggets with a hamburger if they're tolerating those things, and not just doing all chicken nuggets all the time for every meal. If the child doesn't have a wide enough food range to eat 3 different foods, then this is something that's a little bit more serious. We're gonna have to start chaining and making sure that we are giving our child the same foods, but with different sensory properties. So maybe we are, instead of, this is a very basic example, but instead of cutting our sandwiches in half, hot dog way, we're cutting them diagonally. Or maybe we're taking some of our cookie cutters and we're pushing those down into our sandwiches. And we're changing the way that we have the same food presented. That is number 3. So making just a noticeable tiny difference, large enough to be noticed, but small enough that the child will still eat the food. The challenge. Dun, dun, dun. Here are some ways that you can do this. So normally this takes a week per change, but it truly varies from child to child. And then also with your own relationship with your child. So if you might have, you only wanted your kid to eat, so you snuck a few things in their food and they noticed, they may not trust you right away. And so you really can do a few things like inviting them to pack their lunch with you, or having them help you open the canned peaches for the first bullet point and pour them into another container. Having them help you transfer foods to a Ziploc baggie so they can see. If you change the food and then they won't eat it, you messed up, try again. So we go back to our preferred way of it being presented, and then we try again. And have some preferred food out and some change out. We want to make sure that we're not changing too much at once. So try it with one food. And then this is something I want to reiterate before I open it up for questions. We want to continuously present foods to our children. Please continue. They may not want to touch it. They may not want to taste it or look at it or smell it, but we should try and continue to have it in there and expose it to them. Micro progress is progress. So if yesterday they wouldn't taste it, but now they're taking a nibble, that's great. And then just be mindful of the presentation that autism might cause with allergies and those stomach issues. So if you're trying things that are heavy in dairy, allow 3 days between new food presentations. Finally, please contact me if you have any questions. I'm happy to help. I have a huge network, honestly, starting with the Chicago Autism Network, with wonderful providers that they partner with, where we can all work simultaneously together. So if I can't help you, I will help you find someone who can. Here is my contact information. If you want to take a quick screenshot, give me a call or send me an email. I'm happy to help. And here is just some basic info about us and how to contact NSPT in general. And that is all. Thank you.